back for another episode, and I think I'll start today by saying review us, send these episodes to people, do all the things that help us continue to do this. Tell your friends to listen to these three unhinged ladies talk about softball every week. It's a good time. So
we keep it fairly hinged for this conversation. Though we do keep it fairly hinged.
Yeah, I laughed because one of the clips I saw about from a podcast upcoming, it's a little feisty, Ashley, and then also there's a moment where it sounds like the mic just explodes because the volume just gets too loud. The mic was like, nope, it's just like too loud. So it's like that. She's fired up enough that her mic exploded for a second. All right, today we're going to talk
at you. I'm yelling to you, right?
To you, for you.
Yes.
Might even be at you, but it's kind of hard to tell. Yeah.
All right, we're going to talk about our assessment process today and just a little bit about the power of it, maybe even just like kind of where it came from and you know, the information we chose and why the information gets delivered the way it does, because I think there's a lot of thoughtfulness behind the evolution of that, and understanding of where the athletes who are coming to us, you know, why they choose. So maybe I'll just start with a little, like my little spiel when I'm talking to athletes about what our assessment process is, and sort of like what that looks like. So our assessment process basically is to deliver the athlete's story of who she is as an athlete in that moment. So, you know, things can change. This isn't to deliver, this is who you are forever, but to deliver the sort of like important key metrics of who she is as a pitcher or hitter in this moment. And so when we deliver that, we obviously gather a lot of information, but we always start with performance as we're talking to them, which is, you know, this is how you perform right now as stacked up to our high level athletes, right? So the goal that you might have. So when you are considering yourself as a hitter, this is how your exit velocity numbers stack up to the top exit velocities that we have in our sort of database and what that looks like. For hitting, we're looking at how far you do it, how often you do it. So there's different ways that we visualize that process. So a lot of times, and I'll get into the pitching metrics, the conversation, you know, people come to us already good, or they're good in certain things, or they need areas to grow. And so it's really to lay out that story for them of kind of where they might excel now versus where there might be some holes. So in pitching, same idea, velocity, spin, so different break profiles, separation, change of speeds, things we know are important, and how that kind of stacks up in ways we know help pitchers have success at the highest level of the game. We then go into the biomechanics, so what you're doing in your pattern of the swing or the pitch that feeds or doesn't feed those things. So to understand why the performance might be the way it is, it ties to the pattern that you have in that skill. And then the last thing that we talk about is sort of underneath that, what is your movement capacity? And really for us, that's stability and rotational capacity and power, the way that you can produce power outside of the pitch or hit, but in ways we know translate to exit velocity and pitch velocity, or can translate. And so that's kind of the story we put together for the athletes. And I think it's, you know, there's so many ways that it's powerful for athletes and why we think athletes should go through it. But the most like common things that we get, obviously we do this a lot on college athletes. We have done this on professional athletes. But a lot of the times when people are coming to us to get this, it's on high school athletes or like 8th grade. And I think in that age group, there's a couple different tiers of why people come to us and or why we think it's valuable information. One is they are in pain. And so there's a lot of times that mostly pitchers, sometimes hitters will come to us and they are having some nagging injury or reoccurring injury, or they just came back from an injury or whatever the case may be. And they want to make sure that they get to the root of that issue and try to resolve some of that pain. Often we get performance plateaus. They know that they're at a performance plateau. So that's pitch velocity. Most commonly, it's like in the 58 mark. So they have sort of seen growth in pitch velocity, and then they hit this plateau and they want to know why. Same with hitting. A lot of times in these like key jumps in age group, they were a more consistent hitter and then they went up to 16U, or they were a consistent hitter and then they went up to 18U, and they're seeing some drop off in that. And then I think there's this like, and I think we can maybe, Ashley, I'll jump to you on this one first, because I think the other thing we get is they either already know where they're going and they want to know, am I good enough to go there, or am I prepared for there, or how can I keep growing for that? Or they don't necessarily have like this big performance plateau. They're not in pain, but they're just like, I think I'm better maybe than I like am getting looks, or like, am I good? Like, I think I'm good, but maybe my story isn't all panning out for me. So it's not this like big, I have plateaued in some way, but they just want to know, like, what level am I good enough to be at as I go through this story? And so I think that one, those two in particular, are typically when we see more of like the juniors or the seniors who come to us, and they're just really wanting to either prepare for where they already know they're going and make sure they stack up at that level, or they're just, the recruiting maybe isn't going exactly the way they thought or something, and they're like, they just want to know more about their story. So maybe I'll kick it to you there, Ashley. You could talk specifically about pitchers. I can get into some hitting stuff too, but of those different scenarios, and maybe like how you think the assessment process helps navigate that for them.
Yeah, I think kind of, I guess the two buckets that I usually say is, you're right. Like, what is my stuff?
Right.
And where does that put me? Like, where is that scalable? At what level? Now, the reality is you could just go get any ball flight assessment for that. You know, and like, there's a lot of opportunities for that out in the world that are not OGX. You know, you can just get your ball flight and have someone tell you what it means, of course, right? So usually the reports maybe are like, feel a little overwhelming. The human element of explaining not only what that means, but then like, is that good enough? Like, what do pitchers at this level look like? What do pitchers at that level look like? But that's very much a ball flight conversation, which is a part of our assessment process. All the other pieces that you're describing, which is, you know, how stable are you? How well do you rotate? What's your power profile look like? Where do you produce more power? You know, where do you generate the most power from? What are your pitching patterns or hitting patterns, et cetera? This is about targeting training.
Right.
And training out in the universe, out in the world, is like, I mean, I am literally picturing someone with 48 billion darts and a single dartboard, and it's just out. Like, sometimes when pitchers, even that we work with, send us things like, this is what I worked on with at my pitching lesson. And this is not to be condescending and to knock, but I'm like, it just feels like it's kind of like whatever sparked that coach's mind that day, or she saw something in your patterns and was just like, that seems like we should fix that. It's so random. And forget if whether or not the approach they're taking can fix that or not. It's so random in deciding like what we should fix. And honestly, that's part of our assessment process in college, right? It's don't just assume because something looks weird that we should like fix it, right? So basically the assessment process is about establishing what are your strengths, what are sort of like in the middle, and what are things that are like, this is not good. And basically the things that are like not good, whether it's in your strength, whether it's in your power, whether it's something specific about the breakdown in your patterns, meaning how your trunk contributes to stretch. I want to be higher in velocity, and the level of stretch, rotational stretch in your motion is so low. That's what we go for, right? It's like this concept of identifying like what matters. Stop just taking random people's opinions on what should be better and what things should.
Right. I was going to say targets training. Yes. Gives you a guide. It's like targets potential. So I think it's like this one, it shows you like, okay, here's you right now in this moment.
Yeah.
And this idea of like, based on this information, here's where we think you could be. And sometimes those might match, you know, and that's maybe not the best story. And we have to, and maybe it is, it's like your stuff is fine and it's going to be kind of stuck here. And this is how you're going to have to leverage yourself and use yourself. But often there's this idea of like, there is a gap, but don't chase random stuff to get to the gap. You know, I think we have this, the sort of like way we used to approach training before we had information, we could guide ourselves more from this, is just this idea that like, well, everyone's going to get better. You just keep training and everyone's going to eventually they'll throw harder and eventually they'll learn that pitch and eventually they'll hit harder. It's like, that's not true if you're going 85 different directions. And also if you don't know why they're not hitting harder or why they're not pitching harder. And like, so I think this gap of potential and understanding, like basically at any given moment, where is that gap? How big is that gap? Are you chasing the closing of that gap to like raise the ceiling? is the power.
And now we're getting more specific with our data in like within the patterns themselves. Like we've got these kind of training protocols we recommend to go after more stretch through the arm, to get more into like how fast can you unravel the arm, to try to drive more rotation out of the trunk, to target posture, because that's actually the root of why we're not rotating. You know, it's like we're rotating, but when by the time we get top of arm circle, posture is so broken down we can't rotate back, versus we're literally, our posture is fine, but we're not driving rotation out of the motion. And so like there's all these like nuances, like what exactly about the motion is the main challenge when it comes to energy transfer and the ability to create variability. And so it's like, okay, I want a better drop ball and I want it to break more and I want to throw it harder. And so I'm going to spend all my time on my wrist snaps. And we're like, I mean, the reason why you don't do things like that has nothing to do with your wrist action, or maybe even like your lower arm action at all. Those numbers actually came in totally within range,
right?
You know? And so instead we have to target getting more from the upper arm action. We've got to target more getting, you know, like I said, whether it's posture, whether it's rotation, et cetera, et cetera. So it's this combination of being able to identify the real sort of like lowest hanging fruit. This is the main issue here. Maybe it's outside the motion and it's really not your patterns, but assuming it's inside of your patterns, it's also not just like, I mean, let's do more arm circles, wrist snaps, flamingo drills, lunges from the ground, like all the crazy, to throw all the darts and we're going to make everything better. I don't know, and call it leg drive, you know? And so instead it's like, it's so much more detailed of like what segment of the body is not doing its job. It's not giving the body enough. Let's literally go after that. Maybe that's freaking enough, you know, like that's the piece here. And so that's, to me, that's what the assessment is. That's what it's about. It's this very targeted, stop chasing all the things. It can give you information on the spot to understand yourself a little bit better. But then the real power of it is now it's like it's targeted and knowing like that piece is fine. You know, it's fine. It's this piece that's really holding you back.
Yeah. Or you say something?
Yeah, I was gonna say when I hear you talk like so specific about pitching, and I hear from all of that of like this sort of above layer of like we're trying to understand. Every athlete breaks down. Let's just set softball aside for a second. Every athlete, their patterns break down. It doesn't matter what your sport is. It doesn't matter how good of an athlete you are, how well trained you are. It's just the human body. Your body will make mistakes. You'll have fatigue. You'll have whatever conditions that in that moment your patterns cannot sustain. And to be clear, it is not about patterns, whether they're pitching, whether it's your swing, your overhand throw, it does not matter. Patterns are not about, efficient patterns are not about the same solution over and over and over again. What really drives that sort of, adaptability in any movement pattern is the ability to tap into different stuff. And so the explanation I always take with our assessment is like, we're trying to understand you as a hitter, you as a pitcher primarily, of under what conditions do your movement patterns break down. So starting with movement quality of like, this is real low intensity stuff. If you are struggling with, being able to land on a single leg safely, your trunk capacity, your trunk stability, your rotation, there can be no expectation then that all of a sudden shows up when your body starts to move faster. And so we can get to this, and I think of it as like, it's saving you a ton of time. Right. And oftentimes I think what we see is like instructors chasing compensations that are rooted in something that we can uncover and, really understand through the biomechanics piece. So it's like movement quality, power to a certain extent, or like you're like, kind of low intensity under those movements. Your, most maximum intensity are your performance variables, your exit velocities, your pitch velocities. In the middle of that is biomechanics. That's your connector. And so oftentimes when we see instructors like, I like how you said, we'll just call it leg drive. It's like it gets randomly applied, but it's just a compensation, right? And then we end up in the merry-go-round that we all know about. But it's really this continuum of where currently do your patterns sustain and where do they not? And if they don't sustain in low intensity conditions under your pitching patterns, under your swing, we got some strength and conditioning work to do. And then there are times where we're like, oh, this kid has really great power, like lower extremity trunk, and it's not coming through in their swing or their pitching patterns. It's like we see that scenario too, where it's like, you've got it, but there's something, over here, either a style you've been taught or the way that your patterns are manifesting that just like leaves it blocked. You don't express it to its fullest potential. And I when I explain that kind of like low to high in terms of stress and like what are we trying to get us to understand about your body, putting biomechanics in the piece of that, you know, the sensors, markerless motion capture, whatever it is, that's the connector. That's what we need to really understand is like, you can chase all the compensations you want. The most efficient way to know what you should chase is this type of assessment process that takes you through this entirety of your patterns, where you break down, and then how does that relate to your actual performance from a ball flight perspective.
Yeah, I have no idea why my brain went to this, but I just got like triggered by something. I don't even know if you freaking said this, Laura, but I heard it in my brain. The idea of like compensations, I was like, oh, you know what? Like I have certain ones that trigger the hell out of me. And one is like her hips in the way.
Yeah.
She's doing bags like her hips in the way. And I'm like, okay, that's one of the ones that like gets me. It's like she wasn't like, I don't know, using her legs enough. Like there's some of those are like triggering to me. And I was thinking about like, okay, here's what the assessment. Sometimes we're like, you have a spacing issue. Stop saying someone's hip is in the way. It is a spacing issue. Why is there a spacing issue during deceleration phase from top of arm circle down? Is it that there's not enough rotation? Is it that the rotation's not happening on time? Is there also a contribution of arm length being an issue? Like these are why we see spacing issues. That is such a better way of educating that like we have a space issue with trunk and arm during deceleration. It's not just get your hip out of the way. That's a great example.
Well, I was going to say, I think this is, Laura, you said, we can help you get there so much faster. And I was writing it down because it doesn't feel faster to people.
It doesn't.
And so we are like, this is faster. This is faster because we know that what we're targeting is going to have a result. But what feels faster is if someone says your hip is in the way. So we're going to do a drill where your hip stays open and I video you before and I video you after and poof, we fixed it. In one session, we fixed it. Right. Except what we know is that, except what we know is like that person's, the merry-go-round that we reference, it's like you didn't actually fix it. That's not the path to it. And so when I think like we can get there efficiently, like I just posted about an athlete that has trained with us the past 3 years and her sort of like trajectory. She had injuries along the way. She had, because of her injury, she was later to get recruited, but everything generally followed. Like she was a high power kid from the beginning. She had a lot of quick movement. So it was like, you should be hitting hard. Like there's a lot of upside here in you as a hitter. We just got to keep trekking. We know we're targeting the right things. We're measuring it constantly. We're adapting the training to do it. But then she got injured. We followed the ramp up, which feels slow to people. Like there were all these processes. And her trajectory now in hindsight is just like, it's just straight up the whole time. Now there were dips along that way and what that looks like, but we followed it. And what we would say is, we saved you a ton of time, super efficient. We followed this, but that athlete had to stay on board for 3 years to kind of get to that results and get to that. And it doesn't mean she didn't have jumps and spikes and positives along the way, but like that process took a long time. So I think the reason it actually ties what your response actually, what I was going to say is that we are like, this is more efficient, but you have to under that the actual path to player development does not happen overnight in one session. And we have been selling that forever as a community and development. And so when we say like, we can get you there and we can know we're going on the right thing and make sure we're targeting the right things by the things that we measure, because these matter. And this is what feeds velocity. This is what feeds brake. This is what feeds exit velocity. This is what feeds bat speed. We can do all of those things. But if you think it's going to happen overnight and you believe that, like that's where it's sometimes like, that's not what we mean by efficient. And that's not what we mean by faster. You're going to think you are doing it overnight and you're going to end up just like, it's never
merry-go-round of bullshit is
right. Yes. And it's like, we are meanwhile, and I always say this because we have some like junior high kids and I like they're bad because they're in junior high, but I'll often say, like, I will go into train. I'll be like, that kid is going to be freaking good because she's on a random decent team. Like, it's not crazy. They're serious enough that the kid comes 2, sometimes 3 days a week. Like, they show up, but she shows up, she puts in her work, and then she's like, I'm not going to be here Wednesday because I'm going to the beach with my friends. and the kid just is getting stronger and developing, and you see, and we are able to like target where she should be developmentally, and you see this process of like, this kid is not going to be on this merry-go-round. She's going to be, and meanwhile, this kid over here who's above her is doing this. This kid just passes her, you know? So it's like we see that all the time. And so I think from this, why the assessments are so powerful, they still require some buy-in to like, we see it. We see your story and we see how to target it, and we know what matters. We have so much data. We know what plays at the next level. Here's how we're going to target it. And now, like,
and the reality,
trust the process a little bit.
Training is hard because there's so many variables, individual. It's not just like, here's your piece of paper and it's guaranteed to work. Training is a difficult process. It takes a lot of iterations. It takes the data to come back. It keeps showing this. Training is difficult enough. To truly get someone to make a training adaptation in the skill is hard enough. So if you are making that plan off of something that's not the right target, you're literally,
or you're saying they're making an adaptation based on
that they're not. Exactly.
I mean, I think that's the other thing we see too. Is just like, one thing I would question is like, what we are testing in our assessment is the skill, the full skill. And what are they doing in the full skill? And I think this idea that like, you know, we don't ever post things like this. You would never see us post anything like this on our site. But like, if we were then like, see what this kid looks like at our assessment doing the full pitching motion, and now see how we fixed it in a med ball throw. Like, it would be like, no. This might be something we're using to get there. Yeah. But we're not using it to show that athlete we fixed your issue, because it did that trickle through into the skill. So we might use some things like that. We don't use a ton of the totally broken down things, but we might use some little bit broken down things that we know through our training protocols will filter into that. But I think the other thing is, what you actually care about and why the assessment is powerful is the actual, what is the story of the actual skill? Yeah. And what are you able to do
that make an impact on what we're going for, right? Like, you can make changes. You could say, like, see, your hip is out of the way. That is so triggering for me. Even when I say it myself and I know it's coming. But anyway, so it is like, yes, see, your hip is out of the way now. I must have spent my whole career being told that or something, you know? But I
use your legs. Like, oh my gosh.
Yeah. See, it's like, it's better. You fixed it. But the changes that actually make an impact on the goals we're going for in ball flight, those do take time. And there are kind of like, take 2 steps forward, 1 step back, 1 step forward, 2 steps back. Like, that's just how training is, because of life stressors and fatigue and soreness and injury, like, and the environment they're in the high school, and you know, it's just like, there's so many external variables. The training is just kind of a beast. And so at the very least, you know, like, the assessment, we're not like, hope that was right. Like, you know what I mean? Like, the assessment is like a sure thing, man. Like, training is never a sure thing because of all the variables. But as far as like understanding where someone's strengths are and where their categories are, like, that's what we have to go after. That the identification of that is a sure thing. So it's like, knowing you're about to get into this like battlefield of training, at least make sure it's coming off of the right targeted piece and adaptation that we're looking for, versus I have no idea. It's all a guess. This coach says I need to focus on not turning my foot. And this coach says that I need to focus on landing with my foot at 45 degrees. And this coach says that it's really about getting my hip out of the way. And I'm like, I have a headache, you know?
I'm exhausted listening to that. I'm exhausted.
Yes. And so it's just like, that's the normal piece of like, training in and of itself is difficult. At least go in with like, get rid of the noise, get rid of the weeds, you know?
And to be clear, I feel really obligated to make this statement. I can sit here and say that, you know, our assessment is comprehensive. We have iterated, you know, I can tell you all the great things about it. What I want to be super clear about, though, is our process often gets compared to other processes. And I want to be clear that, like, those, typically the things we get compared to are more movement quality based. They're screening tools. They're things that I'll say that, you know, other coaches or groups are trying to make this extrapolation, because it really is this sort of like leap of faith from here's your movement patterns over here to, you know, here's what your pitching motion should look like. And so I can sort of set aside and ignore for a second the missing piece of biomechanics. I could ignore that for a second. I talked about this in pitch doc, that we've had, you know, a rough game of telephone, and how we have, you know, sort of given back to the coaches from a research standpoint, from a biomechanics standpoint, what the motion actually is. We've struggled with that. And I think we are doing amazing work in trying to rectify that. What I can't ignore, though, and I take a lot of heat for this, is like, I can't ignore that there's no measurement over here. Of like, if we're going to just, okay, for a second, set aside that this sort of, you know, what we would call movement quality, but call it whatever you want, results on a particular screen,
mobility,
strength, test,
whatever
you want to, yeah, just something generic that is not pitching specific. I can ignore that there is no biomechanics connector. What I can't ignore, though, is like, there is no ball flight then to tell you if it doesn't matter.
Does that even matter? Is that the kid's challenge?
Bingo.
Is that what we should be going after? It's not like
Bingo.
Everyone's is perfect, but like,
Right.
is that really what she should be going after?
Right. And that's what I want to be clear about, is like, we often, our assessment often gets compared to those other things, and they are not the same. What oftentimes those, like I said, those more generic strength or mobility or these screening tools, they're a piece of that. That's the low intensity, you know, what do you do under the motion? Our advantage is our knowledge of the biomechanics piece, our ability to measure that, to put that into quantitative terms. And then this magic of, all right, then what is your ball flight and what are we doing across this continuum? So like, let's not compare those two things, because they are very, very different. And as you said, I think this was a perfect way to say it, Chris, we measure the skill, right? We measure not just the outcome, but the skill itself in swing patterns and pitching patterns. And that is different than what you're going to get out of a generic mobility screen. Those two things are different.
It would be an example where, like, basically we might see that someone has, like, you know, a decent amount going for them ball flight wise. Maybe it's like kind of underfueled, but patterns are actually okay. Mm-hmm. Actually, I'm thinking of a particular athlete right now, high school athlete, good variability in speed, in brake differential, was like stuck in a velo range and was like, what can I do? And we measured, and I'm like, I mean, her patterns are actually relatively clean. They're kind of like empty, if that makes sense. Like, we weren't seeing things that were really showing stretch. And so we're like, we need to target the strength and conditioning side for her. Right. This kid literally just needs to get stronger. So that would be like chasing, you go into pitching lessons and doing all the drills, where it's like, actually leave your patterns as is. We're going to keep a conservative route on that. On the flip side, we get athletes whose strength and power looks great and their patterns are such a breakdown. So this idea of just assessing an athlete based on the movement quality outside the skill, it might be like, she's doing fine over there. Like, keep going as is there. Don't change. This is that. We've got to make this different. Instead, it's like, we've got to go after the pattern piece. So I think it's like, that's the idea. It's like, we can't just assume this is going to tell us everything. Actually,
and you're not always looking for something that's wrong. I think that's the other thing, is that like, we didn't create a problem and then invent a solution. We're not always looking for things that are wrong. Sometimes it's just simply, you just need to get stronger. Like you said, it's like, your patterns are great. They could be faster, they could be whatever, but underneath of those things, you got to grow some, right? So it's not just
that's going to have the biggest impact, you know.
One of our assessments this weekend was like that. Her patterns looked really good. The kid she's healthy as of now. Mm-hmm. No excessive soreness or pain. She's throwing in the upper 60s. She's on a great track. She had got a great drop ball. Our conversation was like, you need an off speed that looks like this pitch shape, essentially, to go with the pitches you throw, and you need to make sure you keep your arm healthy, because basically, what your arm is tapping into in order to create that, it's at increased risk for experiencing some soreness and pain. So here are the following things that we think you should implement into your daily routines to preserve arm health and go get an off speed. That was literally, the kid was a stud in the weight room, stud in power, good patterns, great ball flights. It was like, that was her real story.
Right. Well, I was going to say, I think it's understanding, you know, we've made some jumps here of like, what matters. So I think for us, you know, we've looked at and understand what plays at the highest level. And so for hitting, it's a certain exit velocity. Like, you're not going to go into the highest level of college hitting 55 mile per hour exit velocity. It doesn't matter how much you make contact. It doesn't matter, I guess, maybe if that's going on the ground and you can run really fast, maybe, but probably not. And so it's exit velocity. Bat speed will feed into that. And then, you start to get into this threshold of exit velocity where now it matters where that ball goes, so that you have more success by hitting it in the air to get to score, which is what we're all trying to do on the hitting side. And so that's the things that matter, right? And being able to do that often in a way that's adjustable underneath that. And so when we say what matters, an example of a story we would have, we had a similar hitter. She's young, so she still has a lot of upside, but her power was very high compared to high level college athletes, like pretty off the charts. She's a freshman in high school. Movement quality was nothing like remarkable. I mean, it wasn't like clean across the board, but nothing like crazy. And so it was like interesting. In that case, it was like, actually, there's some swing stuff going on here. We should see her exit velocity was low compared to that. And so her story is one we don't actually get that often in high school, which is like, let's keep making sure we're moving in the right direction. Strength and conditioning. It's not like don't do strength and conditioning, but let's keep making sure we're moving in that direction. And then also we have to now do some work on the patterns to see things coming out. And so she's been kind of plateauing for a while with us. You know, we've had some work to do in that. And then literally last week, she finally had this breakthrough and just like crushed exit velocities, like 8 miles per hour faster than she had for a while. Cause we finally hit something. Now we have to make it stick, but hit something in the swing. And we knew to target that. And we knew like also to keep telling her that story and holding ourselves accountable to that. We should see a higher exit velocity for you. And so if we can't, like, this is the way we think we can attack. These are the things in your swing we think are causing you not to have an exit velocity based on the data we have. This is how our protocols target that. We're going to keep going after that. If we don't see that jump, you know, then we got to go to understand, like, oh, was our protocol wrong in this instance? Are you like, we've talked about this before, but sometimes like, are you doing something we don't know about? Are you running before you get here? Are you like, you know, there's also things that are you playing another sport? You're fatigued. There could be things factoring in. And we were able to get there with this kid. Now it took a bit and we have to like keep going in that direction. But I think that's the idea. And so for pitching, it's not like what matters: velocity, break, the variability. Break, if you have some variability in break and change of speeds. And so the patterns help us understand like why you are or are not able to create those things.
Yeah.
And then we have over years and years and years tested protocols targeting the things that matter for velocity, for break, and iterated on those. And that's how the process goes. And so I think we feel pretty confident. It's not like, oh, we're every single person. I would say like that would be literally fraud if I was like every person that comes in our door gets better, because you just can't. That's
training's complicated.
Human, but we feel right. But we feel confident that we have at this point, and we will keep getting more information and we will keep iterating as we get more information. But based on all of the available information that we have collected on thousands and thousands of athletes, we know the things that matter for those, you know, the scale that matters for those things to be successful at the next level, the patterns that feed those things, and then when movement breaks down. And I was going to say, Laura, about the mobility and stuff. That's how we started. We did a mobility test, and then me and Ashley were like, what the heck are we supposed to do with this? Like, this doesn't seem right.
Kid's been the same for 5 years doing these drills.
Yeah. And so I was like, this doesn't seem right. And I think now as we get in, like, it's such an important part of what we do. We are constantly reassessing movement capacity and power. So this isn't to discredit all, but there's like, to me, the most powerful version of it is when you see a very elite athlete and you're watching movement capacity, because you are just literally tinkering around with some things. So you see all of a sudden rotation goes down a little bit and you're tinkering. Or the story of the, you know, high school age, middle school athlete who fails everything, you know, who has no stability. And we're like, we could talk all we want about your patterns, but until this cleans up. Or the power too. Like if the power is really low, that's the most powerful version where that can like lead the story a little bit. But for the large part of the people in the middle of that, which is most people, which is just like, oh yeah, sometimes you have thoracic rotation and sometimes you lose it because you're rotating some such, is more of just a fatigue measurement we use in the background of like, are we seeing anything kind of spiking that we want to keep our eye on and make sure you don't go all the way red in that. It really isn't tied to patterns dramatically in our conversation. In the most bulk of the middle athletes that we use, it's not that powerful of a story to say, oh, the other day you had thoracic rotation and now you don't, and so we should change your patterns based on that. It's more of just like, hey, Sally, the other day you had thoracic rotation, then you've been throwing a whole bunch and now you don't. And so like, you know, like we're starting to teeter into fatigue, and eventually that could feed bad things into your pattern. So I think that's what I would say about the mobility thing.
Yeah, I was gonna say if someone, let's say, let's take a calendar year. If an athlete started on January 1st and based on our timeline gets movement quality and power every 6 weeks, they should get to 8 total, right? Over roughly the course of a calendar year. It's not I mean, yes, in the moment it is this individual snapshot, but it's just a snapshot, right? It's just who she is on that day, no different than the entirety and complexity of biomechanics assessment. But it's that year that I think is so important. And it's how oftentimes when I'm talking with athletes and I'm trying to get them to do their movement quality and be a little more consistent with it, it's like, it's not a wag of the finger of like, you're not doing your job, you're not lifting, you're not doing, that's not what that is. It is, we need to be able to take this snapshot at multiple times during the year, at key points in the year. Even we used to do it 12 weeks, we used to just do it quarterly, but we felt that it needed to be a little bit more frequent, particularly in season, for the fatigue factor. It's like, it's not that individual snapshot. The baseline tells a story for that day. That snapshot that we get 6 weeks later is about, all right, can we draw some conclusions about what's improving? Does that stick then on the next one and the next one and the next one? But the context on top of all that is, what time of year is it? Right? And so it's that entirety of that year's worth of information that says, okay, we know, poor Sally, we pick on her all the time. We know, Sally, that when you get in season, you are going to lose X, Y, and Z. You're going to lose your lat mobility, you're going to lose your thoracic rotation. Heaven forbid, you're going to lose your anterior core because you're of fatigue. But we can watch what that does over the year and educate her on like, hey, and this plays up the chain, of course. You've lost a little thoracic rotation. It's totally normal. You're fatigued. You're a two-way player in your high school team. Here, like, let's just like stay the course. Velo's not going anywhere. You're pain-free. We don't panic about that. We don't panic about like, oh my God, you lost your lat mobility. What are we going to do? But she has to know, we talk about like the long game. She has to know then, let's say in year 2, all right, when I go into my high school season, this is where my body gets challenged. This is where I'm at risk for inefficiency, a loss of performance, heaven forbid injury. It's the repeatability of that assessment that is so important to be able to look over the context of a year and for her to understand this is what happens to my body, to my movement quality underneath the skills when I am in season, out of season, playing other sports, when my environmental constraint changes. That's what happens to my movement quality.
Right.
And to me, that's
that's
a piece of the efficiency.
I was going to add one other thing that is specific to the like one-time assessment concept. This has been on my brain recently. Basically what I'm hearing is that like we show movement quality. We think it's important. We usually show it because if it's bad, we want to make sure we're giving them the opportunity to get into good strength and conditioning, like either through us or to improve what they're already doing. But this is not like that's telling us what to do. It's like probably the smallest thing that informs us in a single assessment report. Basically, Krista, what you were saying is that we start with what matters. The first thing we ask, we start with pitching performance or hitting performance. What's happening in your performance data? Is it good enough? And let's be clear, what people are using as is it good enough is how many phone calls am I going to get on September 1? And did I strike out in my high school? That is,
it's the travel ball measuring stick.
Mediocreville, USA, and travel ball, the circus of fatigue. One fatigued athlete versus another. Great measuring.
Right. And if your measuring stick is travel ball, you got to be clear though that like everybody's tired. So that measuring stick is already a bust because everybody is the worst version of themselves.
For sure. So it's like we got the first, when you're like, we know it's scale. So are your tools good enough? So I think this has been on my brain because like that athlete that I was just saying actually came in and was in a really good spot. That's great. It wasn't our job to be like, this is what's terrible about you. We're like, no, this is what's great about you. You want to play at this level? You could. You're a lefty. You're throwing 68 and you throw a -8 drop ball. Do you want to have another layer? Do you want to go this many times through a lineup or this many times? She's like, all I want to do is basically like, I want to be the stud. I'm like, then you need an off-speed pitch. So it's like there's a tier like that. We see athletes that come in, they're like, I'm committed at this level. It's big time. It's power forwards, SEC, whatever. And I say to them, if these tools were on staff now, they would not be good enough. So they're good. I'm not saying you're not a good pickup by them. You're only a junior, but like you have to understand that we know what the tools look like for success at that level. And that's not where you are now. And those athletes don't always know that. In fact, most of the time they don't know that. And then there's the athlete that we talked about majority, which is like, I'm stuck. I know I'm in like average town, like how do you help me grow something outside of that? But I think what's powerful about the assessment, it's not just like when you're bad, you should find out why and get on a better training plan. I think it's also like, even when you're good, even when you're already set to play
Just
somewhere.
go look at go back, scroll through X, look at all the pitchers or top hitters that committed last year on September 1st and see how many are playing major roles. Like there are some.
Sure.
And there are lots that aren't.
Most are not.
Because
absolutely.
That's just not how it works. And so I think I was thinking and we hit this mark and I'm like, all right, we got to wrap it up soon. We're going to lose people's attention. But I think that we often see people who are just going to like all these college camps. I can think of this particular athlete. She's in high school and she is coming for an assessment, but she's going to all these college camps. And we work with a lot of the colleges that she went to some of their camps. And they were all texting me, do you have her, like, did she do an assessment yet? Do you have her data? And I thought, like, that's such a perfect example of like, there's a time and place to go to camps, certainly, but what is priority at and it's also priority in college of what you should do during summer and getting better, what you should do during winter break. What is priority and what there is value in is go find out what your actual story is, where you stack up now. And then if you aren't there, don't go to camp, just get there. If you, and is there a path to get there? Like, how far off are you from getting there? And if you are there,
sounds like you might need an assessment.
Right. If you are there from the assessment, then you probably don't have to go to camp because we could send them stuff. Or you could just go to camp to see if you like them as people and human beings.
And so, it demystifies the recruiting process so much, I think. It really does. Yeah. It demystifies that for families so much. When I like how Josh says, dealing in real, you're just like, this is who I am and I'm watching X team that I really, want to play for on TV. And man, I'm seeing her velos. My velos aren't there. It makes the reality of what that gap is so much more clear. But I also
just so we're clear that Mac Barbara hit a 80.1 mile per hour home run at 40-degree launch angle. So if you know what it takes to be a 3-hitter in the SEC, it ain't your 55 mile per hour exit velocity.
Right. Moonshotting a foul ball 306 feet requires some certain things about the physics of the ball, but I also think like you demystify this process so much, and like you don't have to quote unquote chase these data camps and all these things. Just train specifically with some place that has data for you that you can show your story, because the story oftentimes is way more interesting than your one snapshot at a camp. It's just way more interesting to tell the story.
All right, time's up. In summary, get an assessment or forever throw 3 billion darts at a moving target.
That's the end. Know where you're going. Narrow it down, people. Narrow it down. I'm going to go back to this Missouri versus Clemson game where Clemson went up 5-0 in the top of the second and Mizzou tied it 5-5 in the bottom of the second. So, yeah, crazy times over here. All right.
You say parody, I say chaos. I love it.
Yeah. Here we go. Bye-bye.
Like and subscribe the OGX podcast anywhere you listen to your podcast. It helps us and we appreciate it.